Okay guys, so just to show you how everything is set up. We've got individual dynamic mics on clamps on the edge of the floor tom, and on the single hanging tom here, got an SM57 on the snare. Nothing's cabled up yet, I've just put the mics in position. In the kick drum, we've got two kick drum mics. We've got the Lewitt and we've got the Red5 Audio. Right, then we've got a pair of pencil condensers up here. They're the Lewitt. There's one there and there's one over there, you can just see. They haven't been fully positioned yet. And then I'm doing with the pair of large diaphragm Lewitts, that one there and that one there, we're doing like a Glyn Johns thing. So that large diaphragm condenser is coming in from the side, that one's directly over the top of the snare. They're at equal distance from the snare. Okay, and then we're also recording standard spaced overhead pencil mics. One's there, there's a light shining, but there's one there and there's one there. Okay, now I don't know if I'm going to mic up the hi-hat yet. I might, I don't know. Now the bass rig hasn't been set up yet. On the guitar we've got the ribbon mic, which needs to be finally positioned, and then we've got that Behringer side address dynamic, which is going to be positioned a little bit better over the speaker before we start recording. Okay, so there can be two mics on that. The singer apparently wants to record the vocal. He will not overdub it later, so we're going to record the vocal. But I wasn't expecting this, and I thought we'd be able to do the vocal later with a much nicer vocal mic, but we're going to record the vocal on this audio-technica, okay, the AT2020. Okay, well that's what the singer planned to do, but after trying a couple of songs, he changed his mind, and we are going to overdub the vocals and do them separately on another date. Okay, so we didn't end up recording the vocals on this mic at all. And that just leaves the bass set up. And for the bass, we're going to use the DI box, and we're going to record the bass with some mic. I've got one more large diaphragm condenser mic, so we'll use that, and we'll do a DI into the interface as well. And for the sake of the interfaces, I've changed the setup. I went and bought a Behringer ADA 8200 ADAT expander, because I did some tests on the Presonus and it was just too dodgy. So I'll show you a proper bench review of this product later, or maybe I'll do it before this is released, this video is released. But that's the setup so far in the studio. So the mics are all set up, and what I've got to do is now connect all the cables up. Then we're going to do a test recording and any final adjustments of the position of the mics, right? Then we'll set the bass rig up, and then we can get cracking with that. Okay? There's the laptop ready to go. We're recording onto that small 256 gig USB 3 SSD drive. Alrighty? Okay, so let's have a listen to what we did in Logic now. Let's start with a pair of Lewitts, the two large diaphragm LCT 240 Pro condensers, which were arranged on the kit in the Glyn Johns method, with one of the mics directly above the snare pointing down from above, and the other mic positioned outside the floor tom at the edge of the kit pointing in at the snare. And when you set up a pair of mics in that Glyn Johns arrangement like that, you just have to measure them with a ruler to make sure that they're both exactly the same distance from the snare. That's quite important. Okay, so let's have a listen to what they sounded like. And although I showed them in the photographs just now with the foam covers on, we didn't have those on for the recording. Okay, there they are. That's the one to the left of the floor tom, and that's the one pointing down at the snare. They're both centre panned, and they're going to this group bus here. So I'm going to play them, and as they play, I'm going to pan them out further and further so you can get different pan positions and then pan them back again. Alright, so this is the Glyn Johns pair of condensers on the kit. Okay, so next the stereo overheads, which were the Lewitt 040 match stereo pair pencil condensers. And these are arranged in what's known as a space pair position, where you position the two overheads pointing down at the kit from either side. And with a spaced pair positioning, the further apart the mics are, the wider the stereo image is when you come to finally mix. And then you can adjust that with the pan. So in the case of how I had them arranged, I had one over the kit pretty much level with the edge and centre of the floor tom, and the other one was over the hi-hat and snare position, both pointing down and in at the centre of the kit where the kick drum and the snare is. Okay, so those two pencil condensers are on these channels here going to this group bus, and again they're pan centre. As we listen, I'll pan them further and further out left and right and then back in again so you can hear different pan positions. This is the space pair of overheads. Okay, and finally, my two Tandy Realistic Radio Shack PZM mics. I've got a pair of these. There's one of them, and as you can see, I've converted it to a balanced XLR nitric connector, which is a matter of just putting a balanced XLR plug on the end of the cable. And I've also converted the battery compartment so it can run off a cheap standard PP3 9-volt battery, and then running on the much higher voltage, it performs much better. Okay. Now, I didn't get time to video or photograph these in the studio, but there are two of them on the floor on either side of the kit in the following position. One there and one there. Okay, so the PZMs are on this pair of channels here, and they're going to this group bus here. So let's listen to those. Because they're down on the floor, they're going to have a lot more of a bassy low-mid sound. So let's listen to those now. This is the PZMs, and again I'll pan them out left and right further and further as we listen, and then back again. Here we go. Okay, so that's the three stereo pairs that are not close miking individual drums, and they're all picking up the room as well as the drum kit. And in a kind of summary of them, the overheads are a little bit lighter and a and less present. The Glyn Johns pair a bit more present. A little bit meatier, and the meatiest of all of the PZMs. Okay, now the overheads and the Glyn Johns pair, they're both exhibiting, they're picking up the boxiness. There's a bit of a boxiness in the room because it was a really small room with a low ceiling. It had some acoustic treatment, but it wasn't very, very live, but it wasn't very, very dead either. So there was some reflections coming off the ceiling and walls, and it was a little bit boxy. And the snare had a boxy tone in itself, which was sort of not helping, because the snare would be hit every hit, and that would reverberate around the room as well, emphasising that boxiness a bit. So what, you know, unless you record in an absolutely perfect room, you're always going to do a little bit of corrective EQ on anything picking up the room. So on the Glyn Johns pair here, I've got a channel EQ, and if I bring that in, we're just going to dip the mids out, just lower them down a bit around 1K 900 Hz and further down at around 400 Hz, and a tiny little bit of a shelf reduction on the bottom end. So this is just going to take off that boxiness a bit, and I'll drop this in and out. You can hear it. Here we go. Just sort of tighten things up a bit, right? So that's that. And then same thing on the overheads. They've got a little bit of boxiness, so there's a channel EQ on those, but that boxy mid-range is further down on the overheads, not so much up around 1K. So we're just dipping down the mids a little bit further down at around 450 Hz, centered at 450 Hz, so from 200 up to 1K, and a fairly wide Q, and again a tiny smidge of a shelf off of the bottom end below that. So this is just dipping out the lower mids on the overhead. So let's hear that. Yeah, it's just getting rid of that low boxiness. Okay, so we corrected those a little bit, and they can be further tweaked. We'll look at those again in a bit. Okay, let's go back to the Glyn Johns pair now. And when you do that Glyn Johns miking arrangement, you have to have the two mics on the kit, one above and one across to the side pointing in, and you also have to have a kick drum. That's the minimum mics required for the Glyn Johns technique. So let's check out the kick drum now. Okay, here's a picture of how the mics were set up for that session, both inside the shell, and both of them about 5 inches from the beta head. So here's the kick drums over here. That's the Lewitt channel and that's the Red5 channel, and they're both going to the kick drum bus here. So I'll open that up. The Lewitt, this is the Lewitt. It was recorded in the non-enhanced switching position. So it's a soft sound, soft and deep. Whereas Red5 Audio has got a sort of built-in hyped EQ a bit, which makes it more clicky. Okay, so I'm going to go with the Lewitt, and we've got the kick there. And now if we bring the kick in alongside the Glyn Johns pair, that is everything you need to do the kind of core of a Glyn Johns technique. So let's hear that. Okay, now we did a little bit of corrective EQ on the Glyn Johns pair to dip out those mids a bit. So on the kick now, let's add a kick kind of classic equalization curve like this, where we cut out the low mids to remove that boomy, really low boxiness, hype the real bottom end of the kick a bit, and hype the click area of the kick. So we're scooping out the mids and giving it a boom at the bottom and a click at the top. And that gives us this sound. Okay, it's a lot more thudding now, the kick, right? And then we'll add some compression. Okay, so now we'll blend that more thuddy kick in with the Glyn Johns pair, and we've got a bit more of a controlled sound now. And that is the core of a Glyn Johns recording kind of technique, albeit you can move the two mics in different positions in terms of the height of the one mic over the snare, how near or far it is from the snare, and the side mic then is either nearer in or further out, and again, and the other variation is how high it is, whether it's up more towards the drummer's shoulder or further down towards the head of the floor tom, etc. And what angle it's at, whether it's further towards the front of the kit, towards the floor tom and the ride, or further back, further and further back behind the drummer's shoulder or whatever, or to the side of the drummer's shoulder. But anyway, you know, that's the kind of core of the Glyn Johns thing, that pair of mics and the kick. Now, often Glyn Johns would also record a close mic snare. He'd record that and then he had the option to add it in afterwards. So the pair of mics in this Glyn Johns arrangement, whoops, that's the kick, the pair of mics, we've rolled off the over excessive boxiness of that room sound on them, but we can hear the snare in there now, and we're getting all that lower box mid frequencies of the snare, but not so much in the high end fizz of the snare. So we can go over and bring in a snare. Here's the snare channel, let's listen to it. Okay, it wasn't the best snare, to be honest. I thought it was a bit dull, and we were close micing the head, so you don't get much of the bottom fizz of the snare wires and all that. Now, but the thing is, there's that sort of boxy mid-range quality of that snare, which we've also got in the Glyn Johns pair here, right? So if we don't want to add in the snare mid-range with the Glyn Johns pair of mics having that mid-range of the snare already, what we're looking to do is enhance the treble edge of the snare higher up and the fizziness of the snare wires to bring that in, where it's slightly missing, right? So if we go to the snare channel, we can use an EQ. I'm using a Neve 1073 emulation here. I'm going to cut it at 300 Hertz, right? And then cut at 220 Hertz even higher up. So we're cutting all the bottom end off, boosting the treble at 4.8K, and then a high shelf boost at 12K. So we're really emphasizing the upper end of the snare, and it sounds like this. But what we're getting is that real upper mid crack of the snare with some fizz of the wire. Then if we blend that in with the lower mids that are in the Glyn Johns pair, yeah, we're bringing some of that missing upper mid and cracking edge of the snare back. Then blend it in with the kick, and we got this. It still could do with a bit more fizz though. What most people do is they'll record the bottom of the snare with the mic pointing at the snare wires underneath to really get that cracking fizz of the snare wires from underneath. I will often do that, but what I tend to do nowadays is I'll use the DAW. Most modern DAWs can generate a MIDI note for every snare hit on the snare recording, and then you can use that to trigger a sample and layer a sample with the original snare. So this is my sample I've chosen, which really has a lot of snare wire fizz, right? But it's also got a little bit of boxiness, so I'll bring in a channel EQ here to really reduce the mids and lower end of that snare, and just all we got is the fizz of the wires and that upper crack. So we're going to blend that in with our real snare. We got a really fizzy high-end crack sound to that snare. We can now blend that in with the Glyn Johns pair, and that'll give us that missing upper end treble for the snare that we need. Okay, so let's blend the snare in. Let's hear that. Like that, and then all you got to do is we can add a little bit of reverb. There's a bit of reverb here. It's like some sort of hall. Let's add a bit of that to the snare. You know, and there's a drum sound, right? Okay, now let's mute the Glyn Johns pair, and now we've got a classic snare kick drum sound, close mic'd. Okay, the snare sounds a bit thin, but we did that deliberately, right? If I want to bring that back, I just bring in some lower, some of that, or I can reduce the amount of treble, boost the low mids, you know, whatever I want there, right? So we'll keep that on the treble setting. Okay, so that's the kick and the snare. And then we're going to bring the overheads, and that gives us the classic configuration of a close mic kick, a close mic snare, and a pair of overheads. Here we go. And then if we want to, we can bring in the PZMs to add that low body warmth. There are your options. Okay, we could even bring that low body warmth for the PZMs in with the Glyn Johns pair. Here they are with the kick and snare, and then we'll bring in that PZM with that. So it's the Glyn Johns again with the snare added, and then we'll blend in the PZMs with that low bottom end. Yeah, and that's your kind of your options, right? Okay, so lastly, let's have a look at the toms. They were both mic'd up with a Red5Audio RVD9 dynamic mic, which slightly hypes the sound of a drum, intentionally. They were both mounted on the shell of the tom with a special mounting clamp, and each of them, as you can see, is pointing in at the head at an angle just inside of the rim of the tom. Okay, so let's have a listen to the toms now. Here's the two toms. They're both going to a group bass, I think. Where is it there? Toms, yeah, there. So there's the toms. Let's go to this bit of the track here where the toms are doing a bit of riffing. Here we go. Okay, and then if I put on the EQ on both of them, there's a scoop EQ where the low mids are being scooped out, and a bit of a bass cut on that on the floor tom. It's a bit excessive, the bass on it, and a bit of an emphasis up in the treble end to add some sort of attack to the edge of the skin when it's being hit, and scooping out the boominess of the low mids, and that sort of tightens them up. And then there's a noise gate on them as well, and they sound like this. Again, let's hear that in context with everything else. So we've got the kick, the overheads, and the snare. No PZMs, and then we're going to blend in the toms. Okay, so that's the drums, and obviously to get the mix to the point I'm at with it so far, which is what you heard at the start of this video, I've done further tweaks beyond that. But that's showing you the raw recorded sound that we got for the drums in that room with those mics in the positions we had them, and the sort of tweaks that I did to get those drums into some sort of better shape as a starting point to then begin to do the mix proper. Okay, so now let's check out what we did to record the guitar and bass. Okay, now the guitar. we've got the Tomman own brand RB500 ribbon mic positioned just over a foot away, pointing at the edge of the left-hand speaker in the cabinet. And then the cheap Behringer B906 side address dynamic is dangling over the front of the cab with its capsule pointing right at the centre of that left-hand speaker in the cabinet. Okay, so let's have a listen to those two mics now. And again, remember, this is raw, unmixed, no EQ, nothing. This is just the sound of the raw microphones on the cab. Let's check it out. And finally the bass. In the end, I decided to mic up the bass cabinet, which was a PV combo, with a spare Red5Audio RVD9, which is a dynamic drum mic, but they're perfectly fine for miking up guitar or bass cabinets. They're like a cross between an SM57 and an SM58. Okay, so I've got that recording the cabinet, and the bass itself is feeding into the Behringer DI. So let's just see how that DI box works. Okay, so you bring your guitar or bass into the channel 1 input. Then you take an XLR and you plug that into your channel 1 output. That is taking your DI copy out, and that goes off to your XLR mic line preamp, and that provides your DI copy of the signal coming in at the input 1. And you should switch it to 0 dB to get a good strong level. Now you switch the unit to link, and that means the guitar coming in here is mirrored to channel 2, and both of these become an output copy of the input on channel 1. Okay, then plug a second guitar lead into here, and that takes a copy of the guitar or bass out, and that feeds your guitar or bass amp and speaker cabinet. And you mic that up as normal to get your mic copy. So that's your DI copy, and that's your mic copy that goes off to your cabinet and amp. And finally, you switch it on when you're ready to use it. And that's how you use the Ultra-DI D120. Okay, so let's have a listen to the bass. And remember again, this is raw recording, no EQ, no mix, nothing. Just the raw sound of the recorded mic track and DI track. Okay, so that's the end of another episode of Record Your Band Cheap in a Rehearsal Studio. And please subscribe and put on notifications, because there'll be more episodes coming down the pipe very soon. We've got to get the singer in to track all the vocals, and then we've got to finalise and finish the mix, and then when that's all done we'll do the mastering, and then we'll have the finished product. And I'm going to video diary all those additional stages in the process, so they'll be coming down the pipe. Also coming very soon, I'm going to be doing a full bench review of the Behringer ADA 8200 ADAT rack, which as you saw at the start of this video, I ended up buying for this project and for future projects like this. I'll tell you what it was. The PreSonus ADAT preamp rack that I showed in the first video in this series, where I'm showing the mics. I did further tests on it, and it just had too many dodgy channels, so I decided to bite the bullet and buy the Behringer. I'm very happy I am with it too. It sounds really good. So there'll be a full bench review of that coming, and in that review I'll also show you how to ADAT sync it up to a USB interface with ADAT to get those additional mic line input channels. So we'll be doing all that. And also coming very soon, I'm going to do a little mini review just showing you the realistic or Radio Shack or Tandy, depending which territory you live in, PZM mics. If you're putting together a budget collection of mics, I really do recommend you grab yourself a pair of those cheap PZMs off eBay. So I'm going to be doing a little bench review of those just to show them and to show the easy mods that you can do to make them run on balanced XLR and to run on a much higher voltage but using a cheap PP3 9-volt battery, yeah, which makes them perform better. So that'll be coming down the pipe as well very soon. So yeah, thanks for all your continued support. Please subscribe. Please put on notifications. Any questions or comments, leave them below and I'll do my best to answer and dialogue with you. And stay tuned for more videos coming soon.